Alright, so I'm going to be doing my presentation on Amina Wadud. I looked up the pronunciation of that last name, but if I'm butchering it, I'm really sorry. So, question 1, how does Wadud conceive of the effects of the postmodern situation on Islam, and how does she interpret the resurgence of Islam via this conception? So Wadud begins the interview kind of by talking about her idea of progressive Islam, which is, from my understanding, keeping Islamic values and beliefs intact while progressing it along with societal values. She talks about how Islam as a religion is a progression both spiritually and historically, and this progression continues even though there might have been some historical events like colonialism, the example that she uses, that may have disrupted it, because the Muslims were able to get back on track to continue their, quote, move towards the betterment of our own humanity as representatives or trustees or agents of the divine. And that kind of picking themselves back up was what was referred to as the resurgence by the West. She talks about how Islam is also moving forward in spiritual as well as historical senses, in the sense that they're trying to preserve Islam, but more of an updated version rather than the one that was, quote, in the Medina time of the Prophet. So she's talking about how Islam is kind of moving forward with modernity. An example of that kind of leads into question 2. How does Wadud view the role of the patriarchy in Islam and its genesis, and what effects does she believe it to have had in contemporary Islamic institutions? So she acknowledges that the historical beginnings of Islam reflect the patriarchal society of the time, but she explains that the patriarchal beginnings of the religion does not encapsulate the religion as a whole. It shouldn't be considered the primary focus of the religion of Islam, is her primary point. A quote to support that is just one manifestation, and from it we may get clues, but in it we should not be stuck. This is another point that kind of ties into her idea of progressive Islam moving forward rather than staying back. And in order to progress, we must try to break the tradition away from the historical context of its beginnings. An example of that she brings up is the reformation of Sharia law, where it should be people asking themselves, how can I be good, rather than the government asking, what do we think is good, and how can we create laws to enforce what we think is good without input from anyone else. And she talks about how that needs to be taken into question by people and kind of reevaluated and reformed. Number 3, how does Wadud observe Islam interacting with culture and culture interacting with Islam? What are the differences? So she talks about how Muslims in America face the dilemma of deciding what aspect of Islam is cultural and what aspect of Islam transcends or shapes or develops culture. So I found that in relating culture with Islam, one of the examples she uses is the freedom of religion promised to all American citizens in the Constitution, but also shows the flip side of the discrimination against the Muslim religion for not being a Judeo-Christian religion, and how that wasn't really taken with open arms in America when these Muslim immigrants came. And so culture reacting with Islam is more about how those in the world around the Muslims are reacting to their religion and how they're feeling about the existence of this religion in their community. And on the flip side, Islam reacting with culture is more about how Islam has had an effect on the cultural values, and she brings up that certain Muslim cultures have had certain ideals or aspects that reflect, quote, the Islamic worldview or Islamic spiritual objectives, but she also points out that they do have non-Islamic aspects that make them unique. Finally, how do external symbols influence perception of identity in Islamic culture, especially as pertaining to women? So the primary example she uses in this is the hijab or the headscarf. She believes that the headscarf has kind of become very deeply ingrained in the Islamic culture as the kind of only correct way to represent the Islamic value of modesty. She writes with the assumption that, again, that this, as in wearing the headscarf, is the right way to do it, which is be modest. Therefore, it implies that any other way to be modest is in fact wrong, and one does not want to confess to being wrong. She also brings up that it represents identity as well as promoting uniformity. The interviewer kind of takes her into more detail with that by asking why it's a symbol of liberation and also a symbol of oppression in certain contexts. So she elaborates by saying that it's a symbol of liberation when worn by choice and more of a symbol of oppression when one is forced to wear it. For example, when it's considered the only correct way to be modest, that would be more of an internal force. And the forces can come from internal struggle, like being told it's the only correct way, or thinking, well, if I don't wear it, then how can I be a Muslim? And also from outside forces that we see that have the requirement to wear the hijab in their laws, and that must be upheld. For example, in Iran, she brings up this example of women transitioning from chadors to hijabs after the revolution. And then the wearing of the hijab was adopted into their law, so now it's legally enforced. But they also consider a way for the women to have brought to light their issues with women's rights. So it kind of encapsulates the symbol of representing identity and liberation while also promoting the uniformity and outside forces that are oppressing them, which I thought was an interesting kind of duality to have.